Good morning and welcome to the 2021 Atlas Annual Conference hosted by Ambis University in Prague on the Live2 platform. Apologies, we can't actually be in Prague, but thank you everybody for making the effort to join us during this week. I'm hoping that we'll have a great time and that we will try and make the conference a normal, very sociable Atlas conference. I'm not going to say too much in terms of a welcome. I have done a short welcome video that is available in the lobby. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is to ask Martina Manova, the rector of Ambis University, to open the annual conference for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear speakers and guests, conference participants, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the Atlas Annual Conference 2021, Tourismus 21, Rebuilding Tourism's Continuities and Changes in Prague. Thank you to every one of you to being here with us today. We are proud to be able to host the Atlas Annual Conference 2021 with all of you. Before we get started, I would like to express my appreciation to all of you who helped us make this event come together to become a success. We could not have done it without you. I am grateful to many experts who have come to share this knowledge this week. I also welcome the representatives of the industry who have joined us. It is the first time the annual conference has gone virtual, and I am glad we can connect with everyone. However, we can manage virtual debates with colleagues thousands of kilometers away, but it is of course disappointing for we are not here in the position to be together in Prague. Because academics and researchers more than any other needs to the personal interaction and informal exchanges of ideas and experiences. Nevertheless, it's crucial that this conference take place, and extraordinary achievement that's the technical ways of making it happen have been found after the interruption of 2020. Furthermore, conferences such this provide a valuable opportunity for research scientists, industry specialists, and decision makers to share experience. Let me briefly introduce Ambis University. We are the largest private university in Czech Republic with over 5,000 students in 2 locations. We are in 2 largest cities of our countries, in Prague and in Brno. Founded in 2001 as the first private higher education institution, we have since prepared more than 40,000 students for careers in the corporate and public sector. Our undergraduate and master programs in business economics and management, security management, and regional development, including tourism, are accredited by Ministry of Education in Czech Republic. Ambis University is a part of a Cognos group. Cognos is one of the Germany's largest private and independent educational institutions. It operates technical schools, colleges, and other educational institutions in Germany, Czech Republic, Luxembourg, and other countries. Currently, this group consists of 15 institutions. This conference has a unique theme that is relevant to what is happening in the world 2021. We are delighted to host this conference. It is an excellent opportunity for leading researchers and practitioners in tourism worldwide to gather, exchange ideas, and foster collaboration. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I am sure you will have fruitful and rewarding meetings in the next few days. I wish you every success with this important conference and delightful and stimulating week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martina. Thank you very much to Ambis for hosting us. I think it's a real shame that we can't be in Prague this year, but hopefully as the delegates look through the Live2 platform, they can get a taste of Prague through the pictures and through the posts, through the virtual tour we will do in the next few days, through the cocktails and the welcome reception. So thank you once again. Right, on to our first keynote of the conference. and I'd like to welcome Carina Wren and Laura James. Carina Wren is an associate professor at Aalborg University in Denmark. Her research looks at how tourism interferes with other fields of the social through cultural innovation, and she explores different practices and processes through which tourism is developed, organized, and valued. Laura James is also an associate professor at Aalborg University, and her research focuses on tourism policy and destination governments and the role of tourism in regional development. Their talk today is on All Change, Reflections on the COVID-19 Pandemic as a Transformative Moment in Tourism, and they'll be reflecting on how the pandemic can or can't be understood as a transformative moment and how this might lead to a more sustainable tourism future. So Carina and Laura, thank you very much. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. First of all, Laura James and I would like to give a warm thank you for the kind invitation to the Atlas chair, Tara Duncan, thank you, and to the Atlas board and to the secretariat. Also, we'd like to thank Elżbieta Kiralova and the team at Ambus University welcoming us virtually in beautiful Prague. Of course, we are really sorry to miss out on of meeting at the university and meeting with the Atlas network. Still, we would like to congratulate you on this huge achievement in difficult times to enable us to gather online. We look forward to a couple of successful and fruitful days. So today we look forward to talking about the subject of change in this talk, where we reflect, as Tara was just saying, on the COVID-19 pandemic as a transformative moment for tourism. So there's no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has had an unprecedented impact on the tourism industry. On a global level, it brought international travel in 2020 back to numbers similar to 30 years ago. The latest UNWTO data shows that between January and May 2021, international tourist arrivals were 85% below 2019 levels. The pandemic forced tourism businesses across the globe to close down and had serious economic and social consequences, particularly for countries dependent on international tourism. At the same time, some regions and destinations, often nature-based, coastal, or rural, experienced a tremendous rise in domestic visitor numbers. So our presentation draws together our common interest in innovation in tourism and the evolution of destinations over time, and is the result of our discussion over the course of the last 18 months about the short and longer term impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in tourism. In line with the theme of the annual Atlas conference, Rebuilding Tourism, Continuities and Change, our starting point is a question that many have asked since the pandemic began. So will COVID-19 prove to be a transformative moment for tourism? And what are the prospects for a more sustainable tourism future? Sanzibanez, Anton Claves, and Wilson define moments as path-shaping evolutionary inflection points that cause a destination path or trajectory to shift in direction and focus. And from the very beginning of 2020, there's been a lively debate going on about whether the pandemic will prove to be such an inflection point for individual destinations and for tourism as a whole. Our presentation taps into this wider intellectual conversation in tourism studies, where researchers have attempted to describe, make sense of, and extrapolate insights from events as they were happening. These include publications such as Atlas' own COVID Reflections, published in the summer of 2020, as well as the special issues of journals such as Tourism Management, Tourism Geographies, Sustainability, and just recently, the Journal of Tourism Futures. Many of the contributors to these publications see COVID-19 as an opportunity for change and transformation. For instance, Ioannidis and Gimotti suggest that the pandemic has brought us, and I quote, to a fork in the road, giving us the perfect opportunity to select a new direction and move forward by adopting a more sustainable path. Gößling et al. See the pandemic as an opportunity to, quote, question the volume growth tourism models advocated by UNWTO and other tourism organizations, unquote, and Higgins de Biol described COVID-19 as, quote, a transformational moment, opening up possibilities for resetting tourism, quote. So hopes and visions abound for rethinking, greening, or socializing tourism. But if we look elsewhere in the tourism landscape, the rhetoric is quite different. Although some tourism industry organizations have joined academic researchers in perceiving COVID-19 as an occasion to build back better, mainstream industry discourses often presents COVID-19 as a bump or temporary hurdle to be overcome, calling for back to business strategies and government support to rebuild tourism as it was in 2019. In this presentation, we will consider how tourism destination organizations, businesses, and entrepreneurs in European and Nordic Arctic destinations have reacted to the pandemic in the short term, and whether there is any evidence that it will lead to significant changes in the longer term.
So we would like to begin by reflecting a bit more broadly on different conceptualizations of change in tourism and how they can help us understand the impacts of the pandemic. Now, of course, there are many different ways of conceptualizing tourism dynamics in terms of visitor numbers, new products and markets, changes in the natural and built environment, or the restructuring of governance arrangements. Change can be studied at different scales, from individuals and communities to global social and economic transitions at a global scale. Butler famously conceptualized change at destination level in terms of a product lifecycle trajectory. Others have focused on the way that destinations have responded to global shifts in technology and modes of accumulation and regulation, with waves of change or transitions from one regime to the next. There are, of course, many different factors that affect the development of tourism in different parts of the world. Butler himself, writing in 2009, argued that a unidirectional linear model is relatively unlikely to give an accurate prediction of the future of a complex product subject to rapid change and great competition. However, we do see recurring themes regarding the nature and causes of change in tourism. One key issue is the relationship between gradual path-dependent development and more rapid change precipitated by some kind of crisis or shock, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. The notion of path dependence has been particularly influential and stresses the importance of historical conditions and feedback loops in establishing development paths and shaping the possibilities for future action. The notion of incremental change has also been developed through other path metaphors, for example, path plasticity and path branching, which emphasize gradual shifts in direction and endogenous processes of diversification from existing activities. But what are the impact of sudden crises and shocks, recessions, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, or pandemics? These events often lead to very dramatic alterations in tourism activity, at least in the short term. They've often been analysed within an engineering or ecological resilience framework, where the key questions are how resistant the tourism activity or destination in question is, and whether it bounces back to its previous path or is restructured more fundamentally and shifts to a new trajectory. A different perspective has been advanced by tourism scholars working within the complex adaptive systems tradition, where tourism systems are conceptualized as complex and uncontrollable, characterized by non-linear, non-deterministic, chaotic behavior. So rather than conceptualizing change in terms of identifiable trajectories that are disrupted by external events, complex adaptive systems are understood to cycle constantly through dynamic states with varying periods of stability and turbulence, creating unexpected consequences. So from this perspective, change in tourism is the result of both micro-level processes and local characteristics, as well as macro-scale dynamics. Human agency is a central element in most accounts of change in tourism, and the actions of networks of individuals, firms, policymakers in implementing change have been the focus of countless tourism studies. Thus, moments of change are not just the result of spontaneous triggers, but also of tourism actors actively transforming existing paths. Writing from a chaos complexity theory perspective, Russell and Faulkner emphasised that individual entrepreneurs, who they termed movers and shakers, are able to spot opportunities for innovation during periods of turbulence and can have a disproportionate impact on the trajectory of destinations. In this way, shocks and crises may also be opportunities for mindful deviation from existing paths through policy interventions and innovation. And while evolutionary approaches have typically emphasised that the choices of tourism actors are limited by path dependence, more recent work in economic geography has explored the importance of human agency in creating new paths. Steen, for example, argues that path creation relies on entrepreneurs, spin-offs, diversifying firms, and other actors who more or less strategically recombine and transfer knowledge and resources from different sectors as they act on new and expected opportunities. Similarly, Sotoauta and Grilich emphasize the importance of looking forward, using the notion of the future opportunity space to argue that not only the past, but crucially, perceptions of and expectations about the future also shape path development. So, how can these different perspectives on change in tourism help us to make sense of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic? Clearly, the immediate consequences were unprecedented in terms of scale and scope. But history and geography matter, and destinations have been impacted by the pandemic in very different ways, depending on their existing profiles. For example, their relative dependence on international tourism, their geographical location, perhaps urban versus rural destinations, and policy responses to the pandemic itself, including the level of state aid, the degree and length of lockdowns, and other restrictions on mobility and social gatherings. All of these factors will affect whether the outcome is a renewal of previous development paths or reorientation, but there are also likely to be unpredictable outcomes. So we need to understand how path-dependent processes and local context have combined with the shock of the pandemic. Russell and Faulkner described policymakers and regulators as holding back change. In the case of the pandemic, policy has played a central role. In many countries, the most negative impacts on tourism are related to the policy measures intended to stop or slow the spread of the virus. Border closures, lockdowns, and social distancing, for example. At the same time, we clearly see policies which support the status quo and a return to pre-pandemic tourism as quickly as possible. For example, underwriting airlines and financial support for existing businesses. But we also see many examples of innovation prompted by the pandemic. New products and experiences, the adaptation of existing resources, and a reimagining of what tourism is and could be. So we need to understand how policymakers, entrepreneurs, and communities perceive the opportunity spaces that the pandemic has opened up. Paths and moments are heuristic devices. They help us think about the direction and the nature of change. We don't know what the long-term consequences of the pandemic will be. We're still in the middle of this particular moment, if it is a moment. But we do have some indications. And in the second half of our presentation, we'll present some data and analysis from 3 projects that we've been working on over the last year that have explored how the COVID-19 pandemic has and has not changed tourism in European and Nordic Arctic destinations. So our first take on tourism change during the pandemic is at the level of destinations. And here we'll present some data from the Bouncing Back or Bouncing Forward project funded by the Regional Studies Association. I've been working on this project with colleagues in 7 European countries, and we've conducted a survey and interviews with destination organisations with the aim of understanding how they've reacted to the pandemic in the short term and whether they think that COVID-19 has affected longer term development. So we conducted the survey in spring 2021, and we asked the respondents to rate the importance of a range of different destination issues that they would be focusing on in the next 12 months and looking back to what they had been focusing on in 2019. So we have everything from under tourism, seasonality issues, innovation, market research, collaboration with different actors, and so on. And if we have a look at some of the findings, what we can see in these two figures is how the respondents rated the different issues in 2019 and for the coming 12 months, ranging from red, which was irrelevant, through to dark green, which is very high priority. So if you simply look at the two figures, I know the writing is very small, but if you simply look at the colours on the two figures, we can see that a greater proportion are coloured dark green, very high priority, in 2021-22. So the destination organisations were in general more concerned about nearly all of these issues during the pandemic. So if we look a little bit more closely at the data and compare the mean scores for 2019 and 2021-22, we can see that there are significant changes in 15 of the 18 items. For 13, the mean score has increased, and for 2, international marketing and accommodation capacity, the mean score has decreased. If we look even more closely at how the priorities have changed, we can also see there are some very specific and quite dramatic changes. So the table on the left of this slide shows the percentage of respondents that had rated each issue as a very high priority in 2019 and then for the coming 12 months. The table on the top right shows the top 5 issues rated as very high priority in 2019 and the coming 12 months. And then the bottom right table shows which issues had seen the biggest increases in the percentage of respondents who rated them as very high priority. So before the pandemic, we can see that collaboration with public and private sector stakeholders were the top 2 priorities. But in 2021-22, domestic marketing and health and safety had taken their place. And we see that these were also the 2 issues that saw the biggest increases compared to 2019. So 66% rated domestic marketing as a very high priority this year, compared to 19% before the pandemic. So we see very clear and perhaps unsurprising changes in the short term as destinations have adapted to the closure of international borders and the implementation of policies designed to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But there are also signs that the pandemic has strengthened longer-term trends. Sustainability and digitalization, for example, were in the top 5 very high priorities in 2019 and in 2021-22, but there were substantial increases in the number of destination organisations that rated them as very high priorities for the coming 12 months compared to pre-pandemic. So what about the longer term picture? We also asked whether and how the long-term development vision for the destination had changed as a result of the pandemic. And here we see a mixed picture. Of the 102 respondents that answered that question, 38% said yes, 45% said no, and 17% were unsure. And that mixed picture is also apparent from the qualitative material that we've collected. So while some destination organisations saw the pandemic as an event that had completely changed their ideas about future development, others had not changed their long-term goals at all, or thought that the pandemic had simply strengthened or accelerated existing trends. Now, of course, a survey like this, it's based on a relatively small sample. It only provides a very general snapshot of the experiences of European destinations. But it does suggest that there are some very clear short-term changes in priorities and a rather mixed picture in relation to how the pandemic has influenced the perception of future opportunity spaces. So, having got an overview of the destination level, we would now like to look more closely at the complexities of change in different tourism contexts by examining the experiences of businesses and individual entrepreneurs in specific destinations. And here we aim to tease out the ways in which geography and history have combined with the shock of the pandemic, but also to use the example of entrepreneurial innovation in small businesses to introduce relational thinking informed by actor network theory as an alternative approach to understanding and making sense of change in tourism.
Yes, so in this second take, Pandemic Innovations, we zoom in on some of the very many concrete initiatives, products and experiences that we've witnessed emerging in tourism during COVID-19 and the lockdown. In the context of Danish and Nordic Arctic destinations, we explore the actions and outcomes of individual entrepreneurs, small businesses and organizations in terms of reacting, adapting, making the best of the crisis. The material generated for this draws from two research projects. The first, Artisan, is a Northern Periphery Arctic EU-funded program working with culturally sensitive tourism in Arctic Finland, Sweden, and Norway, as well as in Greenland. So the project was running already before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, the project set up a small task force to look further into the pandemic consequences for culturally sensitive tourism and experiences. So these were collected among small tourism businesses and entrepreneurs through interviews, surveys, webinars, and case studies. The other project that we draw our material from is the Kickstart Danish Tourism Project that was set up by the Danish Agency of Business Development. And here, Aalborg University was in charge of collecting, analyzing, and disseminating knowledge from Danish and international cases on a broad array of tourism-related innovations during the pandemic and the lockdown. So in both of these projects, what we were curious about was generally what was tourism businesses and entrepreneurs doing as the crisis struck, and more specifically, how these small businesses innovated, what they specifically transformed, and why. So first, starting with how to innovate in the time of crisis. So again, as we all know, the pandemic and subsequent lockdown across the globe came as a surprise to everyone. The impacts on the tourism and service industries were very quickly and severely felt. And already shortly after the European lockdown in early spring of 2020, did we see reactions in the shape of business transformations, restaurants offering delivery, takeout, pop-ups to make up for the spaces now closed or restricted. Hotels rethinking their empty rooms as spaces for quarantine, for working away from home when offices were closed. And destinations, which had perhaps been a bit off usual tourism trails before, all of a sudden welcoming big amounts of guests in need of space, quiet, and solace into their rural, coastal, or mountainous spaces. Many festivals and other culture, sports, and music events saw their business disappear almost overnight, as did the MICE industry. While canceling or postponing events was a common strategy, others also reconceptualized their offer, rescaling them into small, intimate events or multiplying them in many different venues. Many events, festivals, museums, and conferences, such as this one, went online to meet and engage with their usual guests and attendees, and possibly also to find and reach new virtual audiences. What we saw here was something that most literature and many policies in fact fail to recognize: swiftly adaptable micro and small tourism businesses. What characterized many of the cases from our field and desk research was in fact a high level of creativity and ingeniousness. Not necessarily in elaborate or costly new setups, but often in rather frugal and modest reconfigurations of components in space and time, and with often surprising outcomes. So the first we saw was in fact this swift and creative innovation. Another tendency, quite opposite to the quick and forced take just described, which was voiced by many entrepreneurs, was how the sudden lockdown had provided time, although by many uncalled for rethinking their business. This way of innovating is not characterized by swift transition, but rather by what we might think of as a slowing down of reasoning. If we look at many of the products developed, many tourism entrepreneurs described in conversation their initiatives not only as forced innovation, a desperate need to rethink their business under a crisis, but also as linked to reflections away from the otherwise busy work life. The lockdown had naturally caused frustration and worries, but also enabled time to reflect on the business, on visions, and translate them into concrete actions. Some described it as an opportunity to do things that they had thought about for a very long time. For instance, to implement new sustainability measures within their business, or to move all or some of their business online. So basically an opportunity and not only a necessity to align products and practices with visions, to bridge the attitude-behavior gap and do something about it. In a Danish context, this is, for instance, visible in 2020 being a record-breaking year for the Green Key certification that we see in hotels and restaurants. So although we might expect a costly and time-consuming certification process as the last thing what would do in time of crisis, the opposite was in fact the case for many businesses. So turning from how to innovate to actually what was innovated. The question is, what kinds of services, products, and experiences were developed during the crisis? In both projects, many of the actions undertaken by tourism actors align with the suggested outcomes of the destination surveys described earlier, where sustainability and digital innovation were prominent. But an overall tendency is, of course, one is tempted to say, the initiatives connected to what we might term as a local turn in tourism. As borders closed, destinations found themselves all of a sudden catering for entirely new markets, domestic and some even local markets. A first outcome of this massive disruption was staycation or domestic marketing initiatives, which we saw emerging across the globe. In Denmark, it emerged under the hashtag of Bare Danmark, just Denmark, a humorous reference to having to make do with staying within the Danish borders. In the island nation of Greenland, usually visited by tourists from across the globe, a hard lockdown forced DMOs to launch Nunaput Nuan, our beautiful country, offsetting a previously almost non-existent domestic leisure tourism trend over the summer of 2020. These marketing initiatives were supplemented by destination and product development to cater for local and domestic guests who often came with other expectations or motivations. As argued by a tourism actor in Arctic Norway about the preferences of the new Norwegian clientele, the cruises were not used that much, but the kitchens was used a lot. And so the entrepreneurs realized that Norwegians have to be treated in a different way. In Greenland, for instance, domestic marketing and domestic transportation subsidies led to a swift development of tours and packages based on the credo, with no guests from the outside, now is the best time to explore and support local tourism. Offers included new products such as a weekend city break by boat from capital Nuuk to a neighboring city of Maniitsoq, not previously well known at all as a tourist destination, or an extended weekend in Kangerlussuaq, known predominantly in Greenland as a flight hub. In developing tourism products and experiences in Kangerlussuaq, many local tourism businesses voiced relief to be finally recognized as a destination rather than merely a waiting room. Across many other rural and remote destinations, did we see extensive destination development activities and the emergence of nature-based products closely related to disappearing and emerging markets, spaces closing down and opening up, and voids to fill and voids to rethink. And to the surprise of many, staycation tourism turned out successful, as argued by this destination manager. I think this summer, we actually had more guests than we had normally, because we did a lot of things on the staycation activities. For many Arctic, often indigenous tourism companies, most often catering for foreign guests, targeting their products to local or domestic markets was a real challenge. Some expressed doubts or difficulties with balancing exotic and mundane components, as well as culturally sensitive issues in new narratives and stories. Can you really sell hikes to people who have hiked in the same spot since their childhood? And can you tell stories of strong indigenous relations to land to non-indigenous compatriots when they also experience a strong connection to land? With small changes, many came to witness that there was in fact a market in this area. With modest adjustments, regular self-catered camping converted into glamping, for instance, upgrading small reindeer tasters to a full 5-course gourmet dinner, or downgrading day-long hikes into shorter ones. Tourism companies were able to welcome local and domestic tourists, who in turn were willing to let themselves be surprised and taken by the seemingly mundane and well-known landscape. What characterizes most of these innovations is, however, that they connect to already existing tourism destination or business strategies, focusing amongst other on local product development and more generally on rural development and on implementing more sustainability. So now let's take a look at why to innovate. An important question in all of this is, of course, why these entrepreneurs innovate. What motivates them? As already argued by Jelleja, there is a research gap in the area on what motivates entrepreneurial innovators. As already previously described, entrepreneurs are often perceived to behave according to an economic rationality or a system logic of capitalism. And unsurprisingly, many of the businesses during COVID-19 were struggling to make ends meet. In this context, again, it's crucial to pinpoint how the situation looked very different depending on the availability and size of national rescue packages made available for SMEs across Europe. But regardless of this, motivations are rarely singular, and many entrepreneurs describe many other reasons for doing what they did. As we saw in interviews with Danish hotels and restaurants who used the time of lockdown to apply for the Green Key certification, as I mentioned earlier. For some of them, greening the business was not only based on a rational or calculated decision or a business strategy, but also was also considered as a meaningful thing to work towards on a personal, more ethical level. For others in Arctic destinations, working with tourism was also connected to personal well-being, to lifestyle choices, and a means to communicate and share local and indigenous culture. For others, for instance, in small and remote Arctic areas, staying in business and remaining so during the crisis was also a question of keeping the community alive. As argued by a Sami entrepreneur, the tourist industry is an important business, and if we leave, there will be a missing link in the community. This confirms previous research on Indigenous entrepreneurship, suggesting that it is often the result of a meshwork of intertwined motivations. So what we've seen in the above is the emergence of a different temporality and of new opportunity spaces. During the pandemic and lockdown, entrepreneurs worked to innovate based on and within these new spaces. The examples suggest that at least some experiences of the pandemic act as a potentially transformative moment. For some entrepreneurs, the pandemic crisis has been characterized by immediate and forced innovation on the one hand. On the other hand, it provides space and time for others to reflect and work on plans and issues that previously had not been addressed due to time constraints within the daily grind. What we saw emerge then was a lot of creativity as local innovations, what was innovated on the ground, came together through the reshuffling of local and global actors, resources, and components, depending on the local context and history of tourism. These entrepreneurial innovations did not reveal a radical shift from business as usual, but most often a stronger focus on approaches already integrated in tourism destination or business strategies on local product development, sustainability, and digitalization. Lastly, local entrepreneurs connected not simply to an economic rationality, but also to a variety of other logics. Question is then, and this is of course where we put ourselves out on a limb here, whether these local, sustainable, or digital transformations will last. Is it a moment? Will these reconfigurations last beyond the pandemic? Or rephrasing, what will it take for them to persist, to have longer lasting effect, and perhaps work towards a more local, more sustainable tourism future? To answer this, a relational way of thinking about innovation and change might be instructive. A relevant resource is actor network theory, an approach and ontology in which innovation is seen as a reconfiguration of people, organizations, technologies, and the environment, allowing something to work differently. Indeed, in our material, we saw the reshuffling of people, spaces, time, and the functionality of idling objects and resources, and drawing on different meanings, ideas, and aspirations. Also components or non-human actors such as certificates, hotel rooms, boats, hiking routes, digital platforms were assembled in tentative new modes of tourism ordering between already existing and new actors. In these new configurations, issues of sustainability, digitality, or locality as well as safety and security, played a role next to economic recovery. In a relational approach, new ideas or concepts have to be inscribed into already existing practices, products, and materials to be made effective and durable. Reversely, new practices, products, and materials also have to be inscribed into existing institutions, policies, and practices to create effect and to endure. And clearly, this is a taxing task. Tourism is embedded in or is a continuity of historical processes. In other words, it is path dependent. The practices and strategies of producers are related to what has historically proven to be possible or not. The universe of the possible is informed by past situations stored in individual and collective tacit skills, anchored in everyday tourism technologies, and institutionalized in destination development strategies. However, things can always be done otherwise, by adding actors and practices to already existing networks, as also shown by René van der Duim in his work on sustainable tourism development in Lanzarote already more than a decade ago. Innovation towards sustainable tourism implies new alliances or reconfigurations of existing alliances in a collective of human and non-human actors that make up tourism. By introducing a view of change as relational, a transformation towards a more sustainable future would most likely not happen through a clear break. Rather, it would take place through a careful ongoing tinkering with work and the everyday, in which and through which tourism is continually assembled, disassembled, reassembled as social material practices. Transformative change entails a reordering of existing distributions of possibilities and constraints, and the mobilization of human and non-human resources into sometimes unconventional new alliances. From a practical point of view, robust transformation must be flexible towards different rationalities beyond the economic and translate into different modes of ordering. Getting things done requires the engagement of multiple logics. This opens up avenues for exploring how economic rationalities or logics weave together with others. Drawing on our material, these include non-economic, community-oriented, and effective modes of engaging into, transforming, and ordering tourism, destinations, or products.
So, in conclusion, let us return to the question that we posed at the beginning of our presentation. Will the COVID-19 pandemic prove to be a transformative moment for tourism? We began by noting contrasting visions for post-pandemic futures, ranging from a resumption of pre-pandemic growth and tourism consumption patterns to a complete transformation of the tourism landscape. We use these contrasting visions as a springboard to reflect on concepts of change in tourism, including incremental path-dependent development, disruption due to sudden crises and shocks, global transitions, and the non-linear and unpredictable cycles of complex adaptive systems. These reflections led us to consider three key questions. How do history and geography matter in the context of a global crisis? How have destination leaders and entrepreneurs reacted? And what opportunity spaces have been created through the pandemic? Drawing on empirical material from Europe and the Nordic Arctic, we've tried to give a sense of what kind of change we have seen so far during the pandemic. And when we look at the experiences and perceptions of destination organizations, we see a rather complex picture. The pandemic is clearly an unprecedented crisis for the tourism sector, and it's been hugely disruptive in the short term. But the impacts have been varied, and the prospects for significant changes to destination development plans seem quite uncertain. While some see the pandemic as a critical juncture, others expect a return to business as normal.
If we zoom in and consider the experience of individual businesses and entrepreneurs, we can see how path dependency and context matters, but also that the pandemic has opened up new opportunity spaces. In at least some parts of the world, lockdowns combined with government support created space and time for reflection and innovation. It showed a surprisingly innovative capacity and creativity of the tourism sector and SMEs, more entrepreneurial than might have been expected. Some destinations radically changed their marketing strategies, and others went all in on product development to new domestic markets. In this landscape, we are seeing destinations and businesses faced with huge disruption, but no clear breaks with patterns or trajectories. Apart from entrepreneurs going out of business, changes have rarely, so far, been transformative. Rather, and using a relational approach informed by actor network theory, what was observed in most places were modest reconfigurations as new practices and products emerged not as part of a path-defining moment, but embedded within an ongoing concern for tourism. Tinkering rather than transformation. So from the view of European and Nordic Arctic destinations, it seems that temporary disruption will slowly be replaced with well-known modes of ordering tourism, some of which anchored to an economic logic of growth, but also others, although modest, concerns with more ethical and community-oriented ways of thinking and doing tourism as a more sustainable, or more culturally sensitive. What will come next and what it will take to develop such tourism futures further does not seem to be drastic disruptions, but instead ongoing and sustained tinkering. Thank you.
Thank you, Carina and Laura, for a really interesting and inspiring keynote. Really appreciate that. So what we now have time for is, I've got two screens up, so excuse me for looking this way, but what we have time for is some questions around this. So we can put those into the chat in live too. So please, all of those of you who have been watching it through live too, please put the questions in the chat. Whilst we're waiting for people to be inspired, maybe I can start, because I don't think we've got any questions yet. And I wanted to sort of follow up on one of the examples you used about community. And you talked about how in Sami entrepreneurs talked very much about how if their businesses disappeared, it would leave a hole, a gap in the community. Did you see this link with community in any of the other areas as well, so explicitly?
Yes, I definitely feel that has also been this turn to community also in urban areas. I mean, speaking from Copenhagen, my hometown, where we had seen a drastic drop in international guests and hotels being completely empty. We've seen this kind of opening up towards the local, and maybe also to rethink, for instance, the hotel as more than a tourism container. So how can we use these? Well, we can think of them as kind of idling objects or idling infrastructures. How can we use them for other purposes? And I think this is not only something we can see that we have seen through COVID-19, but hopefully also something that will persist, that will keep layering the functionalities of tourism infrastructures and also opening up towards the community. So seeing how tourism is related to community and how community can better relate to tourism, integrating the two.
And if I could just add to that, Carina, from the perspective of the project where we've been speaking to destination organisations, doing some of the interviews there has been really interesting in the sense that they've talked about how tourism has become much more visible as an important part of the community. Also how tourism actors have been supporting their community throughout the pandemic. We've got destination organisations talking about, actually, we actually want to stop tourists coming this summer. We've actually tried to tone down our marketing. We need to protect our community, but also talking about hotels and hospitality businesses providing meals and support for key workers and generally engaging in their communities in new ways throughout the pandemic. So that's, I think, also been an interesting aspect of what's happened.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you. We do now, I think, have a question from Melanie Smith, and she is wondering how far and how much destinations will want to invest in domestic tourism, given that many people will be keen to travel internationally as soon as they can.
I think that's a really a good question and a difficult one to answer. Having done the survey and spoken to different destinations, I think it depends on the type of destination, and the big difference we've seen is between rural and rural nature-based destinations and urban destinations. Both have been, in the context in which we've been studying, desperate to attract tourists, particularly this summer in 2021, and have been very much focusing on the domestic markets. For the rural and nature-based destinations in Europe, many of those had a large proportion of their guests were domestic tourists, so it's not a big change for them. People would say it's more of the same. We've had the best summer ever, actually, but we didn't need to do anything different. Whereas, particularly if I think of a Danish context where we are sitting now, in Copenhagen, that was quite different. Previously, very, very dependent on international tourists, has seen a more than 60% drop in visitor numbers. So trying to attract domestic tourists was actually something new for them. Will it continue? I think that's kind of an open question.
But I think actually here that what's interesting is that for instance, in terms of nature-based experiences close to urban environments that have now become or that people living in these metropolitan areas have seen that we can actually use that, perhaps not as a tourism offer, but more like a leisure offer. So there is maybe even a tighter integration between what is a tourism offer and what is a leisure offer, something that we do in weekends or in the evenings. So I think that also ties into how tourism is, moving into not being something very separate from our everyday lives, but something that is more enmeshed in how we live our lives.
Thank you. I've got another question from Lena. She says, as you mentioned, Indigenous entrepreneurship, how do you mean this in the pandemic context? And she suggests that in tourism capitalist systems, the aim is, the linear structure for profit.
So how do I mean it? Oh, sorry, I'm not quite sure.
I'm just reading. Sorry.
Don't kill the messenger.
Yeah. As you mentioned, Indigenous entrepreneurship, how do you mean that in this pandemic context? Tourism in capitalist systems aims in its linear structure for profit.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll try to give an answer. I think
it's the difference between Indigenous innovation and
yes, I think what's really interesting and something that we can all learn from is, in fact, how most of the Indigenous entrepreneurs in a Greenlandic or Nordic Arctic setting worked with tourism, but as one amongst different legs. So also worked with reindeer husbandry, for instance, with the example of the Sami, or having other part-time jobs in public or maybe working with arts or the culinary field and so on, so that you had different legs to stand on. That also means that the tourism wasn't, when it fell or when it shut down, you had other means. So how can we think about entrepreneurship and not something that is solid and only based on one sector, but how can we think more about it as integrating into a life work or a sort of lifestyle entrepreneurship where you do different kinds of things that are not only based on economics. And this is something that we saw that many of the Indigenous tourism businesses worked with, and a logic that made it more robust, in fact, when we saw this crisis.
Lena put a bit of a qualifier, which I think you've addressed, where she says whereas other structures aim in a more circular form for giving back. But I think you answered that. So I'm going to go on. Andrea, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, asks, what about government restrictions? Did you include these factors into your research? How restrictions influence the innovative process of entrepreneurs or DMOs?
I could take that one. Certainly in this bouncing forward project, in our interviews with destination organisations, we talked about this a lot because the restrictions did vary and the experience of the pandemic varied a lot between the different countries. And I think perhaps one thing is that the countries that experienced the most severe lockdowns and the longest lockdowns one had more time, but also were forced to innovate more. So in countries like, and Denmark is a good example, where we had a relatively short and light lockdown in 2020, the country actually started opening up again after Easter in time for the tourism season. So we saw a period of lockdown where there was a lot of innovation around hospitality businesses doing takeout, pop-up restaurants, so on and so forth. But actually, particularly in coastal areas, the country opened up in time for the traditional, the German tourists, the Norwegians and the Swedes actually came to Denmark that summer. So in that sense, the opening up meant that they were less forced to innovate. So I think that made a big difference. Also in countries, for example, where it became possible to hold meetings and events in some form or other, perhaps smaller than before, we saw more hybrid innovations around the use of digital technology, not going completely online, but kind of hybrid solutions, and the same kinds of digital technologies in museums and other kinds of attractions where people were allowed in, but it was a kind of a mixture of online and in person. So I think certainly the restrictions have had a very clear impact on what kinds of innovations we have seen and the degree to which businesses were forced to innovate.
And if I can just very shortly add, something that we saw in Greenland was in fact regulations changing a lot. And I think that is perhaps the most dangerous for innovation, where you have constant changes in rules and regulations. How many people are you allowed to be inside? How long do people need to be in quarantine? So I think that this insecurity, but what is it actually that we need to comply to in order to make this product or this experience fly? That is, I think that if there's something we can learn from this, it is about, communicating clearly and keeping a line as clearly as possible, because that was something that we saw a lot of frustration, and I'm sure that also was part of killing the joy of trying to find out, of doing something new, finding out the next week, we're not allowed to do this anymore.
Thank you. We have another question from Ewan. Have you found any evidence of businesses that were doing badly already from before going under, and thus healthier businesses being the ones leading the way forward?
Well, I think in one sense, probably those that we had on our radar were probably already those businesses that were already interested in, connecting with our projects, that were visible. So in that sense, collecting that material, and I think research projects perhaps in general a little bit skewed, that we're looking already at product or at entrepreneurs that have some kind of surplus energy to connect with projects. So what did I think what we could see was probably this being able to shift, that you're able to shift quite quickly, I think was something that you needed to be able to do, if not to not go bankrupt. That's one thing. Or Laura, you can maybe supplement if you were able to get subsidies, which is of course something that we saw a lot in at least the Nordic context.
Yeah,
so that was what enabled businesses to survive. Sorry,
Carina. Yeah, I was about to say that I think this is another great example of history and geography, and in particularly the role of state support. And we're speaking from a very specific context in the Nordic, particularly in the Nordic context, where there was a lot of state support for businesses. So in a sense, and this was reflected in interviews with destination organizations when we asked about the impact on businesses in their destination, we're kind of in a waiting period, even still, as the help packages have kind of supported businesses that would otherwise have gone bankrupt. And it's still an open question what will happen as those support packages are withdrawn. So in a sense, we are still in this moment. We don't quite know what the result will be in the next 12 months. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Because I think interestingly that Denmark had the lowest amount of bankrupts in decades this last year. So the subsidies are definitely maybe also holding the hand under businesses that would otherwise have fallen. Yeah.
We have another question from Jiri. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. And the question is, do you think that cooperation between entrepreneurs and DMOs is more important than it was before the pandemic?
Well, it's interesting if you looked at our survey results that collaboration was, the collaboration with private sector actors and with other public organisations were the top two priorities before the pandemic, but they've been displaced by these more immediate concerns, health and safety and domestic marketing, in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. But when we do interviews with the DMOs, it's clear they've really stepped up their communication with businesses, and that's something they've really focused on during the pandemic. So I think my answer to that would be yes, they're much more concerned about what's happening. They're acting as an information hub for businesses. They talk about acting as a kind of therapist almost for these businesses which have had a really tough, really difficult year in many countries. So yeah, my answer to that would be yes. I think there has been an increased focus on collaboration.
I'm muted, apologies. Going back to Lena's question when we were talking about Sami entrepreneurship, she also asked whether you thought, so let me go back up to her question a little bit, where we were talking about Indigenous entrepreneurship in the pandemic. And she talked about, do you think that the aim for entrepreneurs more generally is profit, and sort of what some of these entrepreneurs were meaning by support the community?
So if they're interested in profit, and if they were interested in, I'm sorry, I'm a bit slow.
Or what is meant by support the community? What did some of? Yeah.
Well, I think it's not even support. I think it's just understanding that the tourism industry is ingrained in the community. That without the community, no tourism, and without tourism, no community. So I think I am definitely not trying to say that profit is not important. I think it's what makes, gives you bread on the table. So really not underestimating that, but also just to say that what is meaningful in terms of continuing some of these activities that are really hard work and that really fill up not only your day, but your life. What makes it meaningful is not money. People don't necessarily gain a lot of money from it, but it's very meaningful in terms of some of the things we're pointing at, lifestyle, being out in nature, for instance, in terms of culture, being able to share and to share your culture, and also being a part of the community of like, where are my kids? Like, these are also some of the quotes, like, I'm interested in where my kids should live in when they grow up, that they feel like that they want to stay here in this small community. So also in that sense, building the community for the family and for the everyday life that these entrepreneurs are in. I hope that clarified it a bit.
Thank you. And Elzbieta has a question as well. And she asks whether destinations are more willing to invest money into ICT, sort of virtual tours, augmented reality, than before the pandemic.
I don't know whether destination organisations are, but it was a huge theme in I think all of our projects, Carina. Digitalisation, there's been a huge push towards digitalisation, but what people said was it's accelerated existing trends. It's something that we've been planning to do. We've been thinking about this for ages. We know we should do it, but the pandemic forced people to do it. So in that sense, this is, I think, a clear example of an acceleration of an existing trend rather than something that came completely out of the blue.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, these two things with sustainability and digitalization, this was something that we're on the way, and that an acceleration. But I think it's the open, like the ever open question in tourism: who should pay for it? Is it private initiative? Is it public initiative? But I think regardless, there's a lot about how we need to collaborate to do this in a good way.
Can I maybe just add a follow-up to that, and it sort of links back to some of the things I think you were saying at the very beginning about industry seeing it as a sort of a what did you say, sort of the pandemic as a bump, and that we would go back to things. Do you think that this forced innovation with sustainability, perhaps particularly, but also ICT, will slow down again or lose momentum as we go back to or move forward to a new normal?
I think that's, I mean, again, I'd like to say in the context, you know, our little part of the world, because I think that sustainability looks really different depending on where you look. So really from a Nordic or even like Danish context, what we can see with the Green Key, which I thought was very interesting. I mentioned this, that you know, it was a record-breaking year last year. But what's happened is that it's before it was nice to have, now it's need to have. That this is actually not something quite advanced to have a Green Key certification. This is something that most, well, some leisure tourists more and more look for it, but also companies and public organizations, when they book a hotel from now on, I mean, it needs to be Green Key certified. So it's kind of getting ingrained into these institutions and policies like we're talking about. So it's becoming the order of the day and not a niche. I think it's kind of becoming like a mass practice, which I think is a good sign. But again, it's I can only speak from here.
I mean, I think the huge question is business travel and meetings, and certainly that's for a lot of destinations that were dependent on that. That's you know, that's a huge concern. But from a sustainability point of view, it would make a huge difference. Will we go back to? Will we be traveling to the Atlas conference next year? We, of course, on a personal level, hope so. But in terms of sustainability, all the business travel and flights and so on, and it's a big question. Will we go back to the way that we were before? And I think that's another one we just can't answer yet.
Yeah. Although everyone keeps saying one-day meetings, you know, with flight are dead. Let's hope it's dead and buried. Yeah.
Let's hope. Yeah. One final question from Jiri. Has the pandemic at your university affected students' interest in studying tourism?
It's made them more interested in studying tourism, I think. I think in that sense, it's been good for tourism. It's because it's shown how important tourism was socially and economically and culturally. And I mean, I see that when I go out and talk to different students, and the new students that we have in, many of them say they've been inspired by the pandemic to study tourism and understand its the impacts.
Yeah. And I've got a sorry, Carina, carry on, and then I've got a sort of a follow-on question from Willem.
Yes, it's just very interesting because in the last crisis, like mid 2000s, we also saw a huge intake of students, but these were perhaps some that had been laid off or that were looking for, you know, so saying, oh, I cannot get a job after my bachelor's, so we'll continue to do a master program, which is what we have here at Aalborg University. But I think indeed that it's a different kind of, maybe there are not so many jobs. That's maybe also why we're seeing the students taking a master. But I think increasingly it's about really understanding the impact and relations on the social from tourism. Yeah.
And then a sort of a follow-up from Willem. From an educator's perspective, do you think digitalization is something that we should focus on? And any pointers to prepare our students for the future?
I thought you meant like online teaching. Which is a concern, something that does good and bad things. I think with ICT, it's not a good or a bad thing in itself. It's what it does, right? And I think in that respect, how does it enable us to do best? And now I know I'm maybe answering my own question with the teaching. I think that we're seeing things becoming easier for some students, also in terms of mobility and having other activities in their life that are difficult to fit with moving to another place or being on campus every day, etc. So in that sense, I think that that for the teaching part of it, there's good and bad. But I'll be sad if we all end up like this, like not hearing, not seeing, not sensing one another. That would be disastrous. Maybe Laura wants to answer the real question.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it's a challenge for us in the same way it's been a challenge for all these tourism entrepreneurs. It's something that we have seen coming, and we know that it's important. But we also need to understand what are the possibilities, what are the technologies, what could their impact be on different areas of, and we see it, of course, now impacting on all different areas of tourism. So that's something that we need to learn and need to study and understand what it's going to mean for tourism, so that we can, of course, teach our students and understand what they need to learn as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you for answering all the questions. And thank you to everyone for offering up some really interesting questions. We will leave it there. So I'd like, and unfortunately we have to do this virtually, but I'd like everyone on the chat and everyone who's in live too, to just thank Laura and Carina for a really interesting presentation. Thank you for opening the conference with this keynote. We look forward to seeing you over the next couple of days, and hopefully somewhere along the line we can meet in person and discuss some of these issues more. So thanks once again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me move on to the final part of this morning's session before we go into our coffee and cake break. And that is to announce the prizes from the inaugural Atlas Bachelor and Master's thesis dissertation process. And here I'd like to welcome Renee van der Doom, whose name I can never pronounce, sorry Renee, former chair of Atlas and current chair of the Atlas Advisory Board. The advisory board took ownership of this process, and so I'll pass over to Renee to talk more about the process and the winners. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tara. First of all, I would like to thank Carina and Laura for an interesting presentation, and on Friday we will continue the discussion on especially the role of DMOs in light of the pandemic, and I will definitely take on board some of the findings and issues you raised during the presentation. So thanks a lot for that. Coming back to the thesis prize, this is the first year that we decided to issue a thesis prize for bachelor and master students. And as Tara was explaining, this is an initiative of the Atlas Advisory Board, in which some of the old former board members of Atlas are taking place. John Spoorbrook, Melanie Smith, Anna Gotia Pratt, Rob Davidson, and Carlos Fernandez. And we have decided to award a thesis prize for a bachelor and for a master student. And maybe I would like to invite Eleonora to yeah, there's Eleonora. Hi, good morning. Hi.
Hello. Good morning.
Because starting with the Bachelor Prize, the jury has decided to award the 2021 Bachelor Thesis Prize to Eleonora Rossi of Dalarna University, Sweden. And she wrote a thesis about the vulnerabilities of the hotel industry and chain-affiliated hotels that sex traffickers exploit to force women into prostitution. And she executed semi-structured interviews with employees of these hotels, and she identified 14 vulnerabilities. Later on, she will present her results in a separate session. And the jury found this thesis very well written and structured, dealing with an important and for tourism studies unusual topic. The thesis contained very strong sections on methodology, on research ethics, which is particularly, of course, important in light of the topic, and also reflection on research limitations. Results were very well presented based on a number of respondents. It deals with a topic of social importance, with results that could lead to practical actions for industry. So on behalf of the jury, Eleonora, I would like to congratulate you with the first Atlas BSc Thesis Prize. And once again, we will discuss your results later on in a session. Maybe I also would like to invite Sophia, if she's around. Hi, Sophia, and I think you are in California right now.
Yeah.
So
hello.
It must be early in the morning, or
yeah, it's 1 a.m.
1 a.m. Okay, well, good that you're here. You also, well, we don't have a second prize, but we call it the second prize. We highly commended your thesis. You studied at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and you wrote a thesis, a visual analysis of volunteers' tourist identities on Instagram. And you studied photographic practices related to volunteer tourism, and findings show that volunteers perform the identities of the hero, the adventurer, and the advocate, portraying different approaches on how to live the life of a volunteer and interact with the local other. Again, the jury found this thesis very well written about an interesting and topical subject. The thesis has very strong theoretical underpinning based on the sound literature review and lots of insightful comments and examples of critical thinking. It made use of an innovative methodology, and you have also addressed some ethical issues which are part of that. So once again, congratulations with this second prize, to put it that way. And once again, we really enjoyed reading your thesis, and it's a great piece of work. And I actually hope you will also be able to publish about it in by means of an article. I think.
Yeah, hopefully so. Thank you so much.
Your topic really deserves it. Both these theses of Eleonora and Sophia will be presented at 11 o'clock in what is called the student event room. But it's not only for students, it's for everybody. So everybody interested in these two topics of Sophia and Eleonora, please join us in the student event room at 11 o'clock. And then I move over to the Atlas Prize for Master Thesis. We have first Jana. Jana, are you around? There's Jana. Hi, Jana, good morning. Well, the jury decided to award the 2021 Master Thesis Award to Jana. She studied at the Breda University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, and she explored the paradoxes of privacy and big data analysis in tourism destination management. More particularly, she explored the utility of big data analysis in tourism destination management while identifying the paradoxes regarding privacy. It seeks to derive practical policy implications that balance the needs of a digital tourism economy on the one hand and the rights of privacy and data protection on the other hand. Based on her findings, she suggested a lot of recommendations, actually 9 recommendations for DMOs, for destination management organization. And I think that is also the reason why eventually you were awarded the thesis prize, because it doesn't have only, let's say, theoretical implications, but also a lot of practical implications for the tourism industry. So the jury found this thesis of outstanding quality, focusing on an important topical and timely subject, thoroughly researched using a robust methodology. You gave very convincing and well-argued conclusions, again, which have a great potential for practical application by DMOs. In sum, the jury found the thesis a critical, analytically, and intelligent piece of work. So once again, congratulations, Jana. And once again, you will present your findings at 1 o'clock, also in the student room, a session which will be chaired by Tara Duncan. The jury also highly recommended the thesis of Christina Hansen from Wageningen University. Christina, you're also there. Hi, Christina.
Hello.
Well, we know each other from the past when I was still working at the university. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Christina wrote a thesis titled Quietscapes Towards a Sonic Sensibility of Place. And in this thesis project, Christina questions what a sonic sensibility brings to our understanding of contemporary life in a remote Wadden Island, one of the islands in the north of the Netherlands.
No, Germany.
Sorry?
Germany.
Germany, sorry. There's also Wadden Islands in Germany. Sorry.
Yeah, many.
Okay. The research contributes to current thinking on the role of quietness and sensory-based experiences, constructions, and negotiations of place. Next to this, the thesis advances the call to geographers to take part in placemaking and the reimagination of place through a sonic art approach. The jury found this a highly original and regularly executed thesis focusing on an under-researched yet vital theme, the role played by a vital human sense in the tourism experience. They found it beautiful written, and it deals with a very unusual subject in a very creative way. So it's a carefully crafted and thoughtful literature review, which you combined with fascinating fieldwork. So once again, also our congratulations on behalf of the jury for this, what we call the second prize in the Master Thesis Award. And once again, you will present your findings at 1 p.m. in the student event room, chaired by Tara Duncan. So congratulations once again.
Thanks.
Thank you, Renee. Congratulations to all 4 of our students. Really great to see such quality in dissertations around tourism, and we look forward to this becoming an annual event at the conferences. As Renee said, after our coffee break, we will hear from the undergraduate thesis prize winners, and then after lunch, or yes, just after lunch, we will hear from the master's thesis prize winners. So do join us at those sessions if there are not other sessions you want to go to. So now it is time for our coffee break. So please join us after that, but please don't disappear. Stand up, have a wander around, grab a cup of coffee on the Live 2 platform. Please join us in the coffee room. Come and have a chat with those of us who will stay around. Do explore the other rooms, find out where you want to go to a session afterwards, and then we will see you again at 11 o'clock for the first workshops. There is a short program at the top of the Live 2 page, or hopefully we'll all see the updates to the program on the Atlas website. So that is about it for me. Does anyone, Leontine, Jantine, Renee, does anyone want to add anything? Have I forgotten any messages to pass on before we continue?
It's fine for now.
Good. Okay, so get up, stretch, grab a coffee, and we'll see you shortly again for the session starting at 11. Thank you.